Hey Figment, I see that your popcorn bucket is doing really well, you know, the one based on your likeness. So, I'm sorry, but I'm gonna have to ask you to start paying rent for subleasing, because I've been letting you live here rent-free for months now, and I could use it. No, just, you forget about it, that's fine, that's okay. Greetings, everybody. As someone who's been lucky enough to go to both Walt Disney World over in Florida and Disneyland over in California over the years, I've had people come up to me and ask questions such as, which attractions or rides are the same in both parks? Which ones can I find in both? And which ones are completely different? So today I'm going to kind of put together this educational video of which ones I consider to be pretty much direct one-to-one comparisons, ones that are similar but have differences, and ones that are completely different. Now there's a little bit of subjectivity when it comes to this, but I'm trying to do my best to give you as much factual information so you guys can make up your minds about it yourselves. And that way when you're going to Disneyland or Walt Disney World and you've only ever experienced one or the other before, maybe it can be a little helpful for you too in your planning. So let's get to it. To make this a little easier to digest, I decided to break this up into 3 different categories. Those that are identical, ones that are basically one for one the same, those that are similar with some minor differences or some pretty substantial differences, but a similar ride experience, and finally those that are completely different or ones that have enough difference in theming or track to be just their own thing. Let's start with the identical ones. Oddly enough, the 3 Star Wars attractions that we have right now, in that of Rise of the Resistance, Smuggler's Run, and Star Tours, are pretty much the same in both parks. Weirdly enough, Rise and Smugglers are actually pretty much one-to-one recreations on both the West and East Coast, whereas Star Tours, the biggest difference is the queue line, or more so the outside facade of both. The one in Disneyland, it's more just a part of Tomorrowland, whereas in Disney's Hollywood Studios, it's actually got this big facade with an AT-AT and the forest moon of Endor that you get to walk through. But once you're inside the buildings, they're pretty much the same, even though the ride experiences can differ depending on the randomization of it. But it's pretty much the same ride and everything else that you get on both coasts. The next one you go down to is Mickey's PhilharMagic. Pretty much the same in both parks. You'll find it both at Walt Disney World in the Magic Kingdom and also over in Disney's California Adventure. I believe both have the Coco Edition, or by the time this video comes out, they should both have the Coco Additional theme or a scene to it, which is pretty great as well to add that in. Next up, Toy Story Midway Mania. You'll find that over in Disney's California Adventure and then also over in Disney's Hollywood Studios. Pretty much the same ride. Again, it's a queue thing. The one in Disneyland is more so outside or kind of exposed to the air, whereas the one in Walt Disney World, you go inside and there's a big kind of board game queue all over the place, all these different types of board games, more internal queue, but the ride itself, pretty much the same. Now we get to the next one that is identical, except for the queue line. Again, you'll kind of see a reoccurring theme with some of these, but this is Ariel's Dark Ride, or in Disneyland, it's known as The Little Mermaid, Ariel's Undersea Adventure. That's found in Disney's California Adventure. And then over at Walt Disney World, it's Under the Sea, Journey of the Little Mermaid. Pretty much the same ride. The one over in Walt Disney World has a much more extensive queue. It's got some external rock work that you walk through, and you kind of find some treasure, and you get a scuttle animatronic. But then you go on to basically the same ride you go on over here at Disney's California Adventure. So again, a little bit different on the queues, but the actual ride experience, you're still in a clam Omnimover. You go through the same show scenes, and you still see that terrifying sea witch Ursula. Oh boy, she's gonna haunt your nightmares. Next, we're going to move into ones that I would consider to be similar in theme, but might be different in the actual track itself, or the track is basically the same, but the theming isn't crazy enough, but there are some differences in show scenes and sequences to make it different, not identical. Let's start off with the one that people love to talk about the most. I know I do, and that's Pirates of the Caribbean. Now, the Pirates of the Caribbean over in Disneyland is the original, and it's been around for so long, but it actually is a bit longer than the one you find in Walt Disney World. And as a lot of people probably watching this or listening to this might know, the one in Walt Disney World was actually not considered to be an opening day attraction. They weren't going to put it there because pirates, they're really close in Florida, like the Caribbean and all that stuff. It's not as enticing, or so the Imagineers thought. However, everybody wanted it, so they did put a Pirates of the Caribbean together over there. It's a bit shorter. Now, Here are the biggest differences. The one in Walt Disney World, while also being shorter, it doesn't have as an extended cave sequence. It also doesn't feature 2 drops like the one in Disneyland does. But the one in Walt Disney World has a Spanish fort-themed queue that you walk through. Whereas the one in Disneyland, it's pretty much exterior until you go inside, and then you're kind of on a dock in the bayou. A bit different in that aspect. But once you get to the actual show scenes themselves, pretty much a similar experience. But it's just that kind of initial sequence where you're going through multiple drops in Disneyland versus just the one drop over in Walt Disney World. However, I will say this, there is a photo op, the one in Walt Disney World, not at Disneyland, so just be prepared for that. Next up, one of the other big hitters, and that is the Haunted Mansion. This one is an interesting one because the facades are completely different. The one you get in Disneyland is more of a southern plantation, and then the one you get over in Walt Disney World is more Gothic inspired or something like that. It's a bit more imposing, at least to me. And the way you enter is both through the servant quarters for both attractions. But the biggest differences kind of come, I think, in the beginning of the attraction besides the facade. In Disneyland, the stretching room serves the purpose of an elevator. You actually go down and then you go across through the portrait gallery to get to the actual attraction underneath the Disneyland Railroad. Whereas at Walt Disney World, you don't have to do that. They just stretch the room upwards and you just walk out on a smaller kind of queue, get into the Omni Mover or your Doom Buggy, and then go through the portrait gallery. So one, in Walt Disney World, you're riding through the portrait gallery. One, in Disneyland, you're walking through. In Walt Disney World, you do get a few extra scenes as well. You do get a library sequence that you get to go through, and then this kind of hallway where there's a piano being played. And then finally, this kind of MC Escher-inspired stairway room to cap it off. Those are not found in the Disneyland version. However, in Disneyland, the piano player is up in the attic. He's a little bit different. There's a different animation for his shadow. And then also they have the Hatbox Ghost, which I would love to see at Walt Disney World. I'm trying to keep it factual, but I had to throw that in there. But that's something to keep in mind as well. And then also, depending on what time of the year you go, Disneyland, they do the Halloween overlay or Christmas overlay, depending on which way you would call it, for the Nightmare Before Christmas. So if you went, that would be very different than the original that you're going to get over in Walt Disney World. Next up on the list is Peter Pan, Peter Pan's Flight. Yes, the biggest difference that I've recognized with both of these, again, the extended queue line for Walt Disney World. They've added that a couple of years now, or even more than that ago, where you get to walk through the House of the Darlings and whatnot, which is pretty great. But then once you get onto the attraction itself, there are a few differences. The one at Disneyland has more dips in the track. It's a little bit more, I don't know if I say visceral experience, but it's definitely a little less tame than the one found in Walt Disney World. Also in Disneyland, once you finally see Neverland after leaving London, you just see the actual island itself. You see Tick-Tock Croc circling Captain Hook's ship. And then you go into the final sequence with the actual pirate ship, and that's where they put all the characters, including the mermaids at the very end. There's the natives there, and then also just kind of all of it's crammed into that final area with Tiger Lily actually being tied up and about to drown. They don't have that in Walt Disney World. In Walt Disney World, once you go and leave London, which that sequence is pretty much all the same for the most part, you go and you see Neverland, but then you see the various factions like the mermaids there, the natives there, and then you finally see that kind of final fight between Peter and Hook and the rest of the gang. And you also don't get this amazing line over in Walt Disney World that you do in Disneyland, and that's of Peter going, "Pixie dust." Yeah, that's gonna stay with me. Next up's the Mad Hatter Tea Party, the teacups, as we like to call them so affectionately. The biggest differences are in that of the look of it. First off, the one over in Disneyland does not have a covered like roof or anything over it. It just has these kind of hanging lantern lights. And it also doesn't feature a large tea kettle in the middle that you get in Walt Disney World. The ride is basically the same as pretty much all of these on this list are going to be, in that you are in a teacup, you decide how fast you spin, but you kind of spin on a plate and you kind of go around in circles, and then you can go even faster and crazier if you want to. But those ones are pretty much the same experience depending on how you want to interact with them. Next is It's a Small World. Again, like the Haunted Mansion, one of the biggest differences here, the facades. The one in Disneyland is actually basically recreation of the 1964-1965 World's Fair track, but the facade that they made for it was different, and it was its own kind of special amalgamation of all the different architecture of the world. Whereas the one in Walt Disney World is actually inside, harkens back to some of the aesthetic elements of the ones you find in Disneyland, but that's inside, and you're not going to be as exposed to the elements there. The actual track itself is different too. The one in Disneyland is more of a canal that you're in. It's like a little space, so there's like areas besides the actual walls of the canal that are just open air, and they can put more lighting and different elements in there. Versus the one in Walt Disney World where you're literally in like a river with the water going right up to the sides, right near the little dolls and whatnot. Also, the show scenes and where some of the placements of those dolls are is different in both the one in Disneyland and Walt Disney World. So if you're familiar with both, you're probably going to start seeing things. You'll be like, oh, shouldn't you be over here? Shouldn't you be over there? Also on top of this, Disneyland does have actual Disney characters from the animated films kind of sprinkled throughout too. So you might see Alice in Wonderland, you'll see Cinderella, Pinocchio, Mulan, so on and so forth. Next up is the Autopia and the Tomorrowland Speedway. Again, on a similar level of what they're going for, pretty much almost all ages get to drive a car on a track. But for me, the biggest difference is that Tomorrowland Speedway is more of your kind of classic circuit, just kind of out in the open, not too much going on in the way of theming typically. But then the one over in Disneyland has like various tracks that go off-road, and it kind of is more heavily themed on a little bit of the sponsorship they have with Honda, the robots, and Bird, and all that. So there's a lot more to look at, I think, in that one. But then again, the one in Walt Disney World, you get to look up in Tron and stuff too, so that's pretty neat. But again, pretty much the same attraction. Buzz Lightyear Space Ranger Spin and Buzz Lightyear's Astro Blasters are up next. Pretty similar as far as the queues go. Buzz is kind of in different places in both, but both these Omni-Mover shooting gallery type attractions. One of the biggest differences, though, is that the one in Walt Disney World's guns, their blasters are actually affixed to the vehicles. You can't pick them up and move them like the ones in Disneyland. That's one of the biggest differences. And then also, the different targeting systems and some of the rooms and scenes are different. And I don't believe the one in Disneyland features the crazy, like, kind of almost 3D-esque tunnel that the one in Walt Disney World has. But again, very similar. Jungle Cruise is up next. Jungle Cruise, a classic. The one in Disneyland, basically Walt wanted a long time ago for there to be real live animals on this thing, but people were like, that's not gonna happen, Walt. Like, we just can't get them to do that. So they did it the old-fashioned way with animatronics. Now this one, while again, similar in the experience, similar kind of tone with the jokes, some of the show scenes are out of order, but I consider it to be a very, similar experience, or mostly the same, except one major factor. Walt Disney World features a temple sequence in it. Now, this sequence, and I'm not sure if it's because, the skippers would be too loud if they talked the whole time throughout this sequence, but the skippers they shut off their mics or they don't talk or whatever else, they just kind of stand there, and you go through a temple that is not featured in the one in Disneyland. Kind of gives a different experience, but then after the temple, you get the elephants and then you go towards the end of the attraction. Whereas the one in Disneyland, that one has the elephants pretty close. I think it's like the second scene. Again, similar scenes, you're just going to see them a little bit out of order. Next up is Mater's Junkyard Jamboree and Alien Swirling Saucers. Again, these are pretty much the same attraction. It's just the theming that makes them different, and that's why I wanted to put them on this list, because with Mater's, it's outside, it's exposed to the air, but you're also getting pulled around with little tractors over in Disney's California Adventure. But if you head on over to Walt Disney World and Disney's Hollywood Studios, you'll see the little green men, the LGMs, pulling you around with a mostly covered queue once you get inside, if memory serves, and then a covered attraction itself. Again, this just comes down a little bit more to theming, but similar ride and functionality of both. Soarin' is next up. My beloved Soarin' over California, now Soarin' around the world. Exact same ride experience once you get on it. However, I believe that the differences lies with the queue. The queue you find over in Walt Disney World at Epcot is more of just this kind of like long blue hallway. I think they have some kind of travel trivia up on the walls, or they used to, and that's about it. However, the original over here in Disney's California Adventure is a hangar, like an old aircraft hangar that showcases off kind of the legends and the history of California aviation, which ties really well into the original incarnation of Soarin' over California. And once in a while, they do bring that back over here, which is kind of neat to see because it all plays in together. So again, same ride experience, you're soaring around the world, exact same scenes and everything else like that. But I believe that the queue being so different and kind of historical, kind of museum-like, once you get inside, makes it different enough. So if you went in there, you'd be like, oh, where am I going? Is this Soarin'? Like, yes, it is Soarin'. But again, identical ride experience, but that queue, for me, changes it. Again, this comes into that subjectivity we talked about earlier. Let's go next to Dumbo. Now, Dumbo at both Disneyland and Walt Disney World, both from the Magic Kingdoms, as it were, pretty much the exact same attraction. The big differences come here. Disneyland actually added a covered queue a few years ago, which is wonderful, but Walt Disney World's is actually double the fun. There are actually 2 Dumbos over there now, so if you're used to having the 2 Dumbos at Walt Disney World and you go to Disneyland, you are not going to have double the chances or the ease of getting on. And also, Walt Disney World kind of features this interesting queuing area where your kids can go play in the circus, the big top area, and then you'll get called when it's your time to get in line for a shorter queue, which is really cool. But those are the biggest differences. Pretty much identical in the movement and the mechanics of the whole thing, which makes me want to touch on these other ones too, just briefly. Triceratops Spin, Aladdin Magic Carpets, and then also Emotional Whirlwind. All of these pretty similar. The theming is going to be different on them, but if you're familiar with one of them, you're usually going to be familiar with all of them. The Emotional Whirlwind's a little bit different because you can't manipulate your height, I don't believe. And that one is also a re-theme from Flix Flyers from years ago over at Bugs Land, a long time ago. But I wanted to kind of throw those all in, even though I think they're all kind of different, but pretty much the same as far as like you're going, as a flat ride, you're going up and around and around and around, and some of them you can manipulate your height and some you can't. But the theming is different enough to make them not completely identical. Next up is Gadget's Go Coaster and Goofy's Barnstormer. Now, originally, I thought Gadget was like Go Go Gadget, but it's not. It's Gadget from Rescue Rangers and Goofy's Barnstormer. Classic, just beginner roller coasters for the kids or for anyone who is not a huge roller coaster enthusiast. Just the theming is different. I wanted to bring this up though, because some people might want to compare the Barnstormer over in Walt Disney World to actually Goofy's Sky School that you can find over in Disney's California Adventure. Goofy's Sky School, first off, terrifying. Second off, I would compare it more directly to a ride you cannot ride anymore, which is Primeval Whirl over in Disney's Animal Kingdom. More of a Mad Mouse, sits 4 people. Primeval Whirl, you actually sat all next to each other and will like spin around, whereas Goofy Sky School, you sit 2 by 2. Those are the ones I would compare more directly, even though Goofy's got the names in both. And Gadget Go Coaster, for those wondering, pretty sure it's roughly the same track that you find on Barnstormer. Next up, Big Thunder Mountain Railroad. Big Thunder Mountain Railroad, the fun thing about this one is that from Disneyland to Walt Disney World, it's the same track, it's just flipped, it's parallel. It's like if you put one up to a mirror, the other one would be on the reflection of that mirror. It's pretty cool. There's a little bit of a difference in the theming too. One you get for the one in Disneyland, it's more based on Bryce Canyon versus the one over in Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom. That one's based on Monument Valley. There's Rainbow Ridge in Disneyland and then Tumbleweed over in Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom. The one in Walt Disney World is affected by a flood, the town itself, whereas the one over in Disneyland is affected by an earthquake. The biggest difference comes towards the very end of the attraction, I think, and that's with the laser projections and the dynamite exploding and kind of making a different ending of that final lift hill versus the one you get over in Walt Disney World. However, I feel like that's coming down the pipeline eventually for Magic Kingdom. But pretty much the same experience that you're going to get from one to the other. Crazy runaway train, ups and downs, nice spins, and you're going to want to make sure to do that go trick though. Next up, Splash Mountain. Oh boy, Splash Mountain. Splash Mountain is very similar through both parks as far as the theming and the facade and the overall story going on. However, there are some key differences. The one in Disneyland actually has you sit single file. You can fit up to 7 people in that one. There are 6 seats, and I think that last seat is for 2 people. It's more so for a child and an adult. You don't want to cram 2 people back there. I don't know if you could. But the one in Walt Disney World, actually you sit 2 by 2, and they have lap bars. Fun little fact, back in the day, they did not have those lap bars. So it was a little bit more of a scary experience until they added those. Also, in the one in Walt Disney World, it's a longer story, and you actually get a few more scenes of seeing Brer Fox and Brer Bear trying to actually catch Brer Rabbit, and it's not going their way. Pretty much the same drops, though, that you're going to get with both, and again, same story, but just different enough where they're not exactly identical. That's why I wanted to put them on this list. Oddly enough, for those who aren't familiar over in Disneyland, right next to Splash Mountain over there, is Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh. But over in Walt Disney World, you're going to find the Many Adventures of Winnie the Pooh over in Fantasyland, where it has a 35-minute wait for the rest of time. At least. But Winnie the Pooh, you're going to get a very similar experience. The first big difference, though, is that the actual vehicles you're riding in, those are going to be different, too. The one over in Walt Disney World, you actually ride in honeypots, where the one in Disneyland, you actually ride in these vehicles, or these beehive vehicles vehicles, if you will. So they don't have the same type of motion, the vehicles, as the Walt Disney World one, where there is a sequence only found in Walt Disney Worlds at the Magic Kingdom with Tigger and bouncing and kind of through that kind of very dark scene and going through Owl's house. That is not found in Disneyland. Disneyland actually takes the blustery day sequence from the beginning of both and then also adds that raining torrential downpour sequence from the end of the one in Magic Kingdom and puts that right after it. And then at the very end of the one in Disneyland, it's Pooh's birthday after the Heffalump stuff, whereas the one in Walt Disney World, they have the Heffalump sequence, the rain sequence, Pooh gets stuck in the tree, I should say, in that one, and then that's how you end that ride with Pooh kind of living his best self, whereas Pooh is in the honey tree in the Heffalump sequence. You're gonna get similar scenes, they're just gonna be out of order or a little bit different from one to the next, but still a family-friendly dark ride for both. Next one is the Disneyland Railroad and the Walt Disney World Railroad. You have to talk about these are big ones. Again, very, very, very similar. One of the biggest differences, though, is that the one in Disneyland has some cars, or some trains, I should say, that actually feature a sitting arrangement that looks outwards towards, or inwards towards the park, out of the train. Whereas the one at Walt Disney World, at the time of this recording, hasn't reopened yet, but you have everybody sitting and looking straight forward. They do have the straightforward seating over in Disneyland on some of the trains too, but there's a reason why you're supposed to be looking inwards at the one at Disneyland. Because Disneyland features a few sequences that you won't get at Walt Disney World. There's some more additional animatronics, and then also one of the best surprises you're ever going to get is going through the Grand Canyon diorama and then the Primeval World diorama with reutilized animatronics from Ford's Magic Skyway over in Disneyland. It's a nice little treat for anybody riding that coming from Tomorrowland and going into the Main Street station. It's kind of like, whoa, what? Where is this coming from? Walt Disney World does not have that right now, but they both do pass through Splash Mountain at the time of this recording. But it's been years since I've ridden the one in Walt Disney World, so I'm excited to go back and try that one out. Next up's the Enchanted Tiki Room. Once again, very, very similar ride experience, although the actual facades of the places are different. The shows themselves are very, very, very similar, but the Disneyland version has the Enchanted Fountain sequence and then has a little bit more music for you to enjoy as well. The Walt Disney World one, I think, is a little bit bigger, but the Disneyland one is the actual classic original, or Walt Disney Presents the Enchanted Tiki Room. They both are, but there's just some slight differences between the two, but pretty much the same attraction. This one I could have talked about along with Dumbo and Aladdin and Triceratops Spin and all that stuff, but that's Astro Orbiters that you're going to find in both Disneyland and Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom over in Tomorrowland. They are pretty much the same attraction. You get single file into a rocket ship and go round and round and round. The reason I put them on this list not being identical is that the theming is a bit different, the coloration is a bit different, and the placement is different. The one in Disneyland is right at the beginning, the front of Tomorrowland. That's where it is, you can't miss it. However, the one over in Walt Disney World's Magic Kingdom, over in Tomorrowland, sits atop the People Mover loading area, and you get different views and a different kind of feel to it. You have to go up in an elevator. So again, same mechanics, but a different experience overall. So if you're really afraid of heights, do not go on the one over in Magic Kingdom. Maybe start with the one in Disneyland first if you haven't. Next up, again, very, very similar. The carousels, King Arthur's Carousel, you have over in Disneyland, and then Prince Charming's Royal Carousel you have over in the Magic Kingdom at Walt Disney World. Pretty much the same, more Cinderella theming you're going to get over at the one with Prince Charming, and then the King Arthur one, that's more about the Arthurian legend, doesn't really tie fully in, besides maybe like the sword and the stone, but doesn't really have that kind of theming over there. But you're riding the horses, you're going around and around. I'm trying not to quote Happy Gilmore here. Next up, the Liberty Bell and the Mark Twain riverboats going on the rivers of America. Very similar, different in names, but again, like the railroad before, you get some different show scenes because of Disneyland and what they've added. There are a few Native Americans, there's a shaman, there's a chief, and there's some show scenes that are kind of moved or different from the ones that you get over in the Walt Disney World area. But still a slow-moving boat ride, throughout a portion of the park where you get some pretty good views of various attractions depending on the level you're standing. Pretty much the same one again, but different enough to not be exactly the same. Now this one, I feel like you can maybe put on a fully different list, but I feel like they're still the same in the mechanics of how you enjoy them. That's Tarzan's Treehouse and the Swiss Family Robinson Treehouse. Tarzan's and Swiss, you know, in both cases, you're walking up many, many steps and experiencing a story while you're kind of traversing the treetops and going throughout them. The theming is very, very different, but the way you interact with it is pretty much the same. You do get different views for each one, you know, because they're in different parks, but it's still the same concept for both, and that's why I put them in this similar category versus being completely different or identical. That wraps up the identical and the similar ones. Now we're going to talk about the completely different ones, and also, if people really enjoy this, I would love to make one eventually, like a companion piece video, talking about the ones that are completely unique to each park. Let's start with this one. Indiana Jones Adventure: Temple of the Forbidden Eye versus Dinosaur. There might be some of you out there saying like, oh, how is this one completely different versus something like the other ones that have the same track but a different theme? For me, there's so much different between the queue, the experience, the story, and the actual things you see in the attraction that make them feel very unique and different, even though they're utilizing the exact same vehicles and they're using the same track for the most part. So Indiana Jones, you're going into the Temple of the Forbidden Eye to go in to get one of 3 different boons from the god Mara, and that is either you get infinite wealth, eternal youth, or visions of the future. But then somebody in your vehicle, it's never me, but somebody always looks into the eyes of Mara, and you're not supposed to do that, and then it all goes poorly. Whereas Dinosaur, you're actually going back in time. It's kind of a dino heist, and you have to kind of abscond with a dinosaur before the asteroid that destroys most life forms on Earth actually takes you out, and you have to avoid a very hungry Carnotaurus along the way. I love both of these attractions. I've talked about both and why I think one is better than another, but they are so different, like I said before, in the theming. The queue lines, too, are just so different. There's a different feeling and vibe. With Indiana Jones, you're kind of traversing through this kind of dig site and various kind of pieces of what they've unearthed, whereas in Dinosaur, you start off in this museum, and then there's this kind of little briefing, and you get briefings in both, but I think the one in Walt Disney World's Animal Kingdom with Dinosaur kind of sets more of a story for you specifically, whereas Disneyland is just kind of like, we're trying to get as many people as possible, and hopefully they don't die, and they can come out and they can be fabulously wealthy or, you know, young forever or whatever else. But yeah, so I'd say those ones are different, but if you like one of these, like with most all of these ones on this different list, you're probably going to like the other one. Next up is Guardians of the Galaxy Mission Breakout versus the Hollywood Tower of Terror, or just Tower of Terror, found over in Disney's Hollywood Studios. So Guardians, located over in Disney's California Adventure, now a part of the Avengers campus. The biggest difference is, even though they're utilizing the same style of ride in the actual middle portion with the up and down pulls, the Tower of Terror, definitely a spookier, creepier, kind of more methodical experience. And while both attractions actually feature a little bit of lateral movement, because we're used to moving in the vertical on these, but they both have a little bit of horizontal. The one in Walt Disney World, a Tower of Terror, that's more of a full sequence where you're going forward for a while, you go through a show scene and everything like that before you actually reach the drop shaft. Here in Disneyland, you kind of fall backwards a little bit and then go into the drop shaft, up and down, and then you actually go forward at the end. So it's not really you're going through a scene. However, to compensate for this, when you're looking at the different show scenes that you get throughout, like the ghosts in Tower of Terror versus the Guardians themselves, in Guardians you kind of move up and down, you kind of see like this weird energy core thing, you see various scenes playing out, whereas in Tower of Terror, you see the ghosts, you know, you have the window break and all of that stuff, but once you're actually into the attraction's drop shaft, the only big difference is that it's mostly just darkness. Both do feature moments where like the actual doors open up and you can see out over the park, but you can definitely tell that Guardians has that basis of Tower of Terror. But because of the theming and the music and the overall vibes that you get with Guardians, I think it makes it a unique or different experience compared to Tower of Terror. Guardians is way more fun and just like kind of jolly and happy. It's more of a screaming out of joy versus screaming out of terror, which you get at Tower of Terror, which is pretty much quiet besides the screams of your co-riders, if you will. Also, Guardians of the Galaxy does feature a Halloween overlay, which maybe brings it a little bit closer to that of Tower of Terror in the actual mood and vibe of the ride. That's Monsters After Dark. It's a bit scarier, so just keep that in mind. So if you're looking for that kind of Tower of Terror vibe over in Disneyland or in Disney's California Adventure, maybe just try to go over to Guardians when it's Halloween time. Bit spooky. Next, we come up to Radiator Springs Racers versus Test Track. Same basic ride design or machinations of kind of like you're sitting in a slot car. However, the theme, the show scenes, the actual track itself, I believe, is pretty much different from one to the next. Test Track back in the day used to be sponsored by GM and you used to be a crash test dummy. Now they've kind of shifted that over to Chevrolet and you get to kind of build your own kind of dream car and then you get to run through these various tests to see how it performs compared to other dream cars of people sitting in your same car. In Cars, Radiator Springs Racers, basically you are in one of those sentient cars from Cars going into the town of Radiator Springs and then getting all tricked out and ready for a race against another car. Test Track does feature a faster ending with up to almost 65 miles per hour, and I don't believe Radiator Springs Racers gets nearly that fast, but the big thing about Radiator Springs Racers, it's more competitive because you have another car next to you and you want to win, and it doesn't really matter, but both are different enough that I don't think you can say that they are identical. But if you love one, then you're probably going to love the other. And again, some of these could maybe fall into that similar category, but this one's just because of the theme, the ride track, and the overall story being told. I feel like they're their own kind of separate beasts. Next up we have Rock and Roller Coaster from Disney's Hollywood Studios compared over to the Incredicoaster at Disney's California Adventure. And the Incredicoaster used to be California Screaming. They did an Incredibles overlay, and the biggest things you're going to notice is that the onboard audio, the music, and then the lift hills have different moments featuring the Incredibles themselves. Not animatronics, just kind of still figures, kind of showcasing this experience of them trying to recapture Jack, the baby who's got a myriad of powers. Whereas Rock and Roller Coaster, you are trying to get to that concert with Aerosmith, trying to kind of flit in and out of LA traffic. Now, while both feature inversions and a launch, which do make them similar, I think, again, the theming of both of them and the overall ride experience and tracks are different enough to make them their own things. When you go on to Rock and Roller Coaster, you are launched right into inversions and there's a corkscrew eventually, but most of the theming, because it's inside too, that's another big factor. You're going to see these kind of cutouts of signs and things over the ride track. Whereas over in Disneyland, you're completely exposed to the elements for the most part. You launch into that first lift hill and then you get your second little story moment after kind of hearing some of the stuff that you are exposed to right when you get in the actual vehicles themselves. I think both are differing in intensity. Rock and Roller Coaster, I think, is potentially the more intense of the two. The biggest thing about it is it's harder, at least for me, to tell sometimes in Rockin' because it's so dark when I'm upside down or, you know, really high up in the air. Whereas Disney's California Adventure with Incredicoaster, you know the whole time how high you are off the ground and what's coming up. You see the loop coming. So I would say that they're both kind of intense in their own ways, but they are still similar enough. I think people like to try to compare them, but still, I think they're their own separate things. Next up's Grizzly River Rapids, Grizzly River Run, and Kali River Rapids. Both are these kind of raft water rides. You sit kind of in a circle and go throughout various show scenes and moments throughout nature. Now, the reason I put this here versus similar, and maybe this is another one that could kind of maybe fall in between the two, is that Kali River Rapids has a story and a message. It's about deforestation and humans' impact on the natural environments of the world. And then also, I believe it only features the one drop. I think Grizzly features two. And Grizzly River Run is mostly just you on a raft going through the Pacific Northwest, and you kind of go through that iconic bare mountain facade, and you hear like the roars of a grizzly, but that's about it. I kind of wish they put a grizzly animatronic up there, but I don't really know if that'd bring people in. I just thought it'd be cool. But also, Grizzly features more of a spin fall at the end versus Kali. Kali's got a little bit of that, but those two, to me, they feel different enough. But I think for a lot of people that you might just put it into the similar category. Still, you're gonna go on this thing, you're gonna get wet, probably no matter what, but I feel like the theming and some of the track is different enough, and the stories trying to be told here are kind of their own thing to make them unique, but still, you're gonna get drenched. Next up is Disneyland Presents Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln, right up against the Hall of Presidents. Similar in concept and theme. I was thinking about maybe comparing this all to the American Adventure, but I feel like American Adventure is its own other thing. But Great moments with Mr. Lincoln, obviously featuring the 1/16th president of the United States. No, he's not 1/16th the size, the only 16th president of the United States, and his story focuses way more on the Civil War. Whereas with the Hall of Presidents, you're going to get everybody. It's more of a spanning scope of all the presidents that the United States has had over the years. Again, sitting in a nice, dark, cold theater, you're getting a bunch of information. Typically, usually more interesting to older patrons of the parks. The kids might not be as enthralled by this experience, so just keep that in mind. But because of the number of presidents and the stories being told, once again, I put this in the different category just because they feel like different things, where Great Moments with Mr. Lincoln is focusing heavily in on just that one president, and he does get some time to shine over in the Hall of Presidents. The Hall of Presidents is its own kind of like tribute to America in a different way altogether, but still kind of that same patriotic feeling permeates both. Next up, we're going to start talking about the mountains some more, and that is Space Mountain over in Disneyland's Magic Kingdom, or just Disneyland, and then Space Mountain over in Walt Disney World over in the Magic Kingdom at Tomorrowland. Now, I'm going to kind of mix this up a little bit with the Expedition Everest found over at Animal Kingdom in Walt Disney World and the Matterhorn in Disneyland. Matterhorn. Now, why am I doing this? A lot of people like to compare Space Mountain to Space Mountain 1-to-1. However, I would say while the theme is the same, the experience, the queue, everything is different. In Disneyland, you're sitting side by side, you have the onboard audio, it's a very smooth track. I like to call it the toilet bowl because there's a lot of just turning around and around. Not as many dips and dives that you're gonna get with the one over in Florida. Florida's got, again, I'm trying not to be, play favorites here, more extensive queue, more iconic queue, I would say, and you're sitting in a single file row, kind of like the bobsleds you find on the Matterhorn. Space Mountain in Walt Disney World doesn't feature any onboard audio or anything quite like that, and that's one thing that people cite as being great over in Disneyland. But I kept thinking, why do I like Space Mountain in Walt Disney World and I like the Matterhorn? It's because they're roughly the same track, the same seating kind of style, and they're both kind of a rough experience. So for people who like the Space Mountain in Walt Disney World, I would also say you're probably going to enjoy the Matterhorn over in Disneyland. You could still compare the two Space Mountains, but I still feel like they're different enough where, yes, they are the same in name, but the actual roller coasters themselves are just their own beasts entirely. I also talked about this with Theme Park History a while ago. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. Tell them Jimmy sent you. But now I need to talk about Expedition Everest, Legend of the Forbidden Mountain, compared to the Matterhorn bobsleds, just for that comparison's sake. Once again, Expedition Everest, kind of its own thing, a very, very interesting story, very long kind of museum-esque queue line, and a build-up and a showdown with this crazy thing called the Yeti. Now, just for people, I'm going to make a video about this eventually, but the Yeti over in Walt Disney World is different than the Abominable Snowman. Over Matterhorn bobsleds, a lot of people call the Abominable Snowman a Yeti over here in Disneyland. It's not the case, not in the Disney mythos. It's my own problem, I know. But still, the one you find over in Animal Kingdom, Expedition Everest, sit side by side. It's a bit rougher. It has a backwards sequence to keep in mind. The backwards stuff usually gets to me the most, so if you're not a fan of going backwards on an attraction, keep that in mind as well. Matterhorn bobsleds, an old classic, the first roller coaster and first mountain Disney ever built. It's a bit of a rough ride. I will just tell you that right up, but it weeds out the weak, is what I would say. A lot of people like to compare those two, but again, I would like to compare Matterhorn bobsleds to Space Mountain in Walt Disney World. I don't know if you can really compare Expedition Everest and Space Mountain in Disneyland, even though they do sit side by side. I think those are two completely different things. But again, I know it sounds kind of like a drawn out thing, but hopefully that helps you figure out. If you like roller coasters, you're probably gonna like all these anyway. But if you like Space Mountain in Florida, you're gonna like Matterhorn a ton over in Disneyland. But if you love the Space Mountain in Disneyland, the Space Mountain in Walt Disney World, that might throw you. It's gonna be much more like the Matterhorn. Just keep that in mind. Next, I want to touch on this briefly. The monorails. The monorail in Walt Disney World versus the monorail in Disneyland. Here's the way I explain it to people. The monorail in Disneyland is like a ride that also kind of services as a transportation vehicle because it can bring you to the downtown Disney area and then back into the park. Originally, it just made a whole loop and it just went right back into Disneyland. However, the monorail over in Walt Disney World, the monorails, actually serve more so as a form of transportation first and as a ride second. They help get people to the Magic Kingdom. They don't actually bring them into the Magic Kingdom. And also there's a line that goes over to Epcot. Kind of like the Skyliners too. They're more transportation first, ride second. It's just kind of like a fun way to transport versus a bus or a boat that you're normally used to. I want to touch on that briefly because some people might consider the monorail that you find over in Disneyland to be an attraction all of its own, whereas the one in Walt Disney World, it's more about getting to and from various hotels and parks. And finally, the People Mover, the one you find over in Walt Disney World and Tomorrowland, and the People Mover you find over in Tomorrowland at Disneyland. The biggest differences are the one in Walt Disney World, it goes to various show scenes and kind of goes around Tomorrowland and you can see various things, and the one in Disneyland, it doesn't, like the tracks there, but it's not, it's not happening anymore. So, yeah, if you've gone on the People Mover in Walt Disney World, yeah, you're not going to ride the People Mover in Disneyland. Not right now. It'd be really cool if they brought that back, though. That'd be nice. And again, like I said before, if you guys have a want or a desire to see a follow-up video where I talk about attractions or rides that are wholly unique to each park or the various parks on both coasts, please let me know. I would love to make that for you. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me today. I hope you found this video interesting, educational, and again, there's a little bit of subjectivity in there too. So please leave your thoughts down in the comments. I would love to hear what comparisons you would make if you had to kind of compare both the parks as far as Disneyland and California Adventure versus the 4 theme parks over in Florida. And I'm not even talking about the rest of the parks, but I can only speak to those when I've actually gone there because I have not yet. But one day, Tokyo Disney Sea. Okay, sorry. Anyway, a huge thank you also to our patrons. I appreciate you guys so much for supporting the channel. It means a heck of a lot to me. And until next time, just remember to adapt and overcome.